My name is Haley Dushinsky. I'm an associate professor of anthropology and also the director of the Center for Law, Justice, and Culture here at Ohio University. And I'm really pleased to welcome you all today to this panel celebrating the publication of a remarkable book, Money at the Margins, Global Perspectives on Technology, Financial Inclusion, and Design. The book was published by Bergen Books as part of their series on the human economy. The book originally came out a few months ago in 2018, but it was recently, just within the last few days, released in paperback. So we are celebrating today both the publication and the release of the paperback edition. The book represents an innovative interdisciplinary project based at the Institute for Money, Technology, and Financial Inclusion at the University of California, Irvine. And the book came out of several years of research and collaboration and discussion among researchers based across the Global South. The book itself is comprised of 13 chapters, and each one of the chapters focuses on new monetary technologies. This includes mobile money, e-commerce, cash cards, retail credit cards, other forms of new monetary technologies. And it looks at how these technologies shape people's financial lives and their social lives in specific sites across the contemporary world. So our panelists today are the three co-editors of the book, all of them economic anthropologists. So we're very pleased to have with us on this panel Dr. Smoky Musarai. Dr. Musarai is an assistant professor of anthropology here at Ohio University, and she's also a faculty affiliate of the Center for Law, Justice, and Culture. We're also pleased to introduce Dr. Ivan Small, who is an assistant professor at Central Connecticut State University. And we're also pleased to welcome Dr. Bill Maher, who is Dean of the School of Social Sciences, Professor of Anthropology, Law, and Criminology, Law, and Society. And he's also the director of the Institute for Money, Technology, and Financial Inclusion, all at the University of California, Irvine. And Dr. Maher is joining us today via Skype. All right? So please join me in welcoming our panelists, and I'll hand the floor over to them.
Thanks, Haley. Thank you all for coming. So as Dr. Dushinsky said, I'm Smoky Musarai, and this is Ivan Small. We both came to work together on this project while we were postdocs at the Institute for Money, Technology, and Financial Inclusion at UC Irvine from 2012 to 2014. So that's sort of where the book started coming together. I'm going to say more sort of specific things about the book a little later, because I want to make sure that we hear from Bill, because he can only join us for a short time. But so I first wanted to ask Bill. So Bill Maher, as you heard, has a lot of amazing hats that he puts on. But the first thing the way that I first knew Bill was actually as one of the leading anthropologists of money. So I'm an economic anthropologist. My research has been on money and speculation in Albania. So Bill was sort of the founding director of the Institute for Money, Technology, and Financial Inclusion. And from now on, I'm going to call it the IMTFI, because that's the way we called it, and we call it. So you know that's the acronym. And so he's been, he founded this institute. He got a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to fund fellows from around the world to do research around money, financial technologies, and other practices. And so when we joined the Institute, that basis was already there, and a lot of the fellows that we included in this volume had already been starting their research and gotten grants from the IMTFI to do their research. So Bill is I was really glad that Bill found time in his very busy schedule to join us today. So I'm gonna first ask him to say some words about sort of his vision of this project, not only of the book, but sort of the bigger project of the IMTFI research and other research that he continues to do in around money, technology, and financial inclusion. And while I do that, I'm going to actually turn off these lights so that you can see him better. Okay, Bill, I'm giving it off to you. Handing it off to you. I think there's a delay, so. Oh, ah.
That's it.
Hold on. What happened? And now our technician left, and we can't hear you. Okay, I think we can hear you now. Could you hear me, Bill? Hold on.
Yeah.
Okay, so I can hear you. I just introduced you and said that you are going to say some wonderful things about money, technology, financial inclusion,
Got it.
your vision, and so on. And
Okay,
we can hear
I
you
basically
now.
can't hear a word you say unless you're right there in front of me, okay?
I'll be back.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. I want to thank the Center for Law, Justice, and Culture and Haley at OU for having this event to celebrate the launch of the paperback version of this book. I think what I'll do is just tell you a little bit about what IMTFI is and how it came to be, because that'll help kind of situate what we did and also how this book came to be and why Ivan and Smokey joined me at UCI for a period of time. So, as Smokey said, I am a cultural anthropologist and an economic anthropologist, and I've been studying things having to do with money and finance for most of my career. I began doing work in the Caribbean, looking specifically in the 90s at the emergence of the offshore financial services business. I was interested in how Caribbean countries became tax havens and what the implications of the large-scale flows of money through these tiny little places were for the people living in those places. So I was really trying to locate and situate the social dynamics of what was then a new form of finance. And yes, it was like around money laundering and like, drug trafficking and all that great stuff. So I can talk more about that if people care, but that's kind of what got me into thinking about money and finance as an anthropologist. It led to some other work that I did on Islamic banking and finance, efforts to create banking and financial systems that don't rely on interest, which is forbidden in many in many parts of Islamic jurisprudence and legal thought. So I did some work in the UK and in the US and also in Indonesia, looking at Islamic finance as a global phenomenon and trying to understand what it could teach us about alternative forms of finance and banking. Along with that, I also started studying the alternative currency movement, and this is people around the world who print their own money or set up their own barter systems to stand outside of national currency systems like the US dollar. In particular, I focused in Ithaca, New York, which has had a long-running alternative currency called the Ithaca Hour. So I was doing all this sort of weird money stuff. And in fact, one of my Islamic banking informants once said to me, like, someday you should bring together all the weird money people to talk about weird money things. And he was talking about himself as well as other folks that I was working with. And I was invited in around 2005, so I'm taking you all the way back, to write a review essay for the annual Reviews in Anthropology, which is an annual that comes out every year in which anthropologists kind of summarize an entire subfield. I was asked to write a review article for them on the anthropology of money. So I did, right? You go do the literature search and you think about your argument and you put together all the kind of historical perspectives on money from the discipline of anthropology, how it relates to economics and economic sociology and so on. So I wrote this paper kind of imagining that it would probably only ever be read by like 15 to 20 grad students who were preparing for their qualifying exams, right? Because when you write such a thing,
That was me.
it's kind of like an encyclopedia article that someone's just going to consult when they're desperate and they don't want to go read all the stuff themselves, right? So I thought, I'm done. My work here is done. One day, I'm sitting in my office, and there's a knock on the door. Knock, knock, knock. And I open the door, and there's this guy in a short sleeve button-down shirt, right? With a pocket protector complete with pens in the pocket protector, and big glasses, and looking like incredibly dorky indeed. And he's holding in his hand a copy of my paper, like a printed out copy of my paper, and I can see it's all marked up. And I'm like, okay, this is going to be a crazy person, so I need to just kind of have a nice little chat and get him out of my office as soon as I can. So he says, are you Bill Maurer? I'm like, yes. And he says, do you write this essay? I said, yes. And I'm like ready to go, like, knock on the door of the secretary next door. And he says, well, my name is Scott Mainwaring, and I work at Intel Labs, the chip designer, the chip manufacturer. And my team has been tasked with thinking about the future of money and digital money, and all they want to talk about is security and encryption. But I read your paper, and I have a feeling that social, cultural, and political dynamics of money are going to matter a whole lot more to whatever money is going to become than just making sure that it's safe and secure, right? And Intel, as a chip manufacturer, is very concerned with security and that sort of thing. But Scott had this hunch that the sort of things that anthropologists study was going to matter a lot more in people's everyday behavior around money as it went digital. Now, mind you, the iPhone did not yet exist, okay? All the things that were going to start happening in the domain of money and payment because of the ability of people to carry around these super powerful computers in their pockets everywhere they go, with geolocation and with links to their bank accounts and links to social media, none of that existed. So we ended up talking for about 4 hours. It was amazing. He invited me up to Portland. I met his team. We began a kind of collaboration, which was mostly just me teaching them stuff. And it fed into a whole body of work at Intel, really trying to think about the consumer side, the user side of what we just had an inkling then were going to be new forms of payment based on mobile. So that happened. Scott and I started to plan a big conference to bring together the people who were thinking about this thing, both from industry and academia. And I had another visit, although this one was by phone. I get a phone call out of the blue from a woman named Amalo Ngueno at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And she says, I've heard about this work that you're doing with Intel, and I've looked at some of your published writings, and I wonder if you've ever come across anything about people using mobile airtime credit as a form of money in Sub-Saharan Africa, right? And she was talking about sort of the use of top-up phones like this old Nokia, where you'd go to a kiosk and you pay some money and you get a little card with that sort of scratchy wax stuff on it. You scratch off the wax, there's a secret code, you enter the secret code into your phone, and then you've got new minutes to talk with, right? And I said, I do not know anything about this, And she says, I wonder if you'd be willing to come up to Seattle for a convening that we're going to have. You don't have to speak. I just want you to come and be a fly on the wall. Just listen. Be an anthropologist, right? Be a sort of participant observer, and then let's talk about it. So, I said, sure. So I go up there, and basically it was a session where the Gates Foundation was asking for advice from major payment providers. And it's things that are household names for you, but I won't name them. Because the Gates Foundation was interested in seeing what it could do to accelerate the use of digital payment around the world, on the theory that digital payment is safer and more secure and less at risk of theft or loss than people using banknotes, using paper money, which is what most people do in the global south around the world. And also that this might have the potential to be a way of getting people who are currently in informal economic arrangements into the formal economic system, which we can discuss and debate. Like, I am extremely agnostic on that as a thing. There's all kinds of problems that we can talk about. But what happened at this convening was basically everybody was pitching their thing, right? They were like, the wave of the future is going to be this thing. No, it's going to be my thing. And I'm not talking about little startups, but like big, humongous companies that you all know who they are, but I'm not going to say who they are. And it was pretty dumb. And so afterwards, she takes me off the campus of the foundation. We go to a little cafe where we can talk freely, and she's like, "What did you think?" And I said, "Well, it was basically crap. They're all coming to you, with their palms open, asking you for tons of money that they don't need because they're big, giant, companies anyway. They're just interested in partnering with you, probably as a kind of whitewashing, right, to look like we're doing good work and doing our corporate social responsibility or whatever." And she said, and I'll never forget it, she sort of went like this: "Yes, this is our problem. We're the Gates Foundation. Everybody comes to us asking for money." And I said, "Well, if you really are interested in doing stuff around digital money in the developing world, how are you going to do that?" And she said, "Well, I was hoping you would have some ideas." And I said to her, "What you need is some kind of, third-party entity that independently is reviewing and vetting and conducting real research on what's happening in these countries around the world as new forms of electronic or digital payment come to town." So they can give you real insight from the ground, right? And I said to her, and I don't mean to offend anybody I haven't already offended, if I've offended people. I said to her, you don't need McKinsey, right, to send a team to parachute in for 2 weeks and do a giant panel survey and then leave. What you need are local people, local researchers who know what's going on, who are connected, who have a stake in the communities where these things are happening, and who will have the trust of people around them, who have family members and other kin who are also involved in some of these new systems of money and payment that are coming up, and who can do real research and then give you, some stuff to stand on when you want to start making decisions about your own investments. So she liked that idea very much. She enjoined me to help them write a call for proposals that was going to go out to academia, to create, issued a call for proposals to create research centers that would do exactly this. So I helped them write that call. It went out to the world, and again, I considered my work done. A few months after that, I get a call from them, and I'm like, "Oh, how did the call go? Did you get any proposals?" And she said, "Well, you didn't apply." And I said, "Well, I wrote the call." She's like, "What's wrong with that?" I'm like, "Well, it's kind of a conflict of interest." To which she said, "We're the Gates Foundation. We don't care about that." And so then this is when it sort of really got real, right? And I thought, okay, if they really are interested in doing this, I want to make sure that we do it the right way, the way that I had initially proposed it to her, which would be not to fund me to go do a bunch of research around the world, but really to find and nurture and fund a whole new community of researchers based in the global south at universities, nonprofits, think tanks, design firms, whatever, who saw what was going on in their communities as people were starting to use things like this to pay, who started to see things like Kenya's very famous mobile money service, M-Pesa, which is based exactly on the same kind of airtime model, except instead of selling you airtime credits, they're selling you money, right, denominated in Kenyan shillings and held in the cloud, connected to your phone account. Get people who are seeing this happen, who speak the languages, who know the communities, and grow a kind of global brain trust, so that it wouldn't always be the same people going to the Gates Foundation or speaking at the World Bank or going to the UN and saying stuff about mobile money and financial inclusion, who haven't sort of lived the life of people who were involved in what was happening on the ground. And also, I was very strongly committed too to basically spreading the wealth. If the Gates Foundation is going to give me a whole bunch of money, UC Irvine needs it, but a lot of institutions in the third world needed a whole lot more. So how can we find people and get the money to the people to do the work where they're located? So that's how IMTFI came to be. They bought my crazy plan, and we began a process of sort of a star search of trying to ferret out researchers around the world who were intrigued by what was happening in the domain of money and payment when new technologies came to town, who were sensitive to local conditions, and thought we could ultimately help inspire kind of collaborations with one another and conversations with one another, so that it wasn't always going to be, Visa, MasterCard, the Gates Foundation, and the Boston Consulting Group having these high-level conversations about this thing that was unfolding around the world, but people deeply informed by the context in their home countries. And what we did, and we had a model where we issued a call for proposals every year. We got it out globally. I think someone might talk about how we did this a little bit later, so I won't say too much, but suffice to say, we could not just use the internet. We had to use paper too, to get paper posters out all over the world and hung up in offices so people would see them and reply. We'd get in proposals, and then Scott from Intel, who I put on my board, he and I, with another team of people from academia and industry, would review and vet these proposals and then make decisions and issue awards. The researchers then would go off and do their own independent research project, and we'd bring them all together to UC Irvine every year, midway through their projects, so that they could meet each other, learn from each other, so that we could deal with any course corrections or other things that needed to happen, and ultimately to help them make a better research product. One of the only requirements that we put on them in terms of the research product was that they put out something into the world that actually was meaningful in their own professional career. So if they were academics, we helped them get academic journal articles out or academic books out. If they were policy people, we helped them get policy reports out. If they were designers, we helped them do design stuff and make kind of booklets or collateral that would impact design and the tech industry in their country. We really wanted it to not just serve, this mission of finding everything there is to know about mobile and digital payment, but also serve this emerging constituency that we were helping to create, this global network of interdisciplinary scholars and other researchers around the world. So that's what we did. And this book is one product of that long-standing collaboration. IMTFI continued with all of its support coming from the Gates Foundation for 7 or 8 years. We then transitioned to a number of other funding sources to keep the network going, but also to start exploring other things that were happening in the world of money and electronic payment. We collaborated with the British Museum on some things and with the Smithsonian. And I could go on and on and on, but I think that probably gives you an overview of what IMTFI is and how this all came to be. And Ivan and Smokey joined as postdocs, and their job was to basically work with this global network of researchers to ensure that they came out with the best possible product in whatever form that it was. Great. That's IMTFI. I think that's where I'll stop for now.
Thank you. And we could hear you for most of the time very well, except for a little bit in the end, but we could hear you very well. I know that you have to go. Do you have time to take a question, or?
Yeah, I can stay for another half an hour.
Oh, wow.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That's bonus. That's awesome. So that's great. Are there any questions right now, or we can also continue? But are there any questions? And actually, this is a great overview, Bill. You will see that you've already hit on some of the points that we were trying to keep as a surprise. I think you will know this, but the author of the cover of the photo of this book you already just mentioned. So, not to mention that you also showed the phone that's in here, but we'll talk about this in a series. Yeah. Any questions about? Bill did a great job at also explaining what some of these terms are that sometimes I have a hard time explaining in my class, like what is mobile money, what is all the other digital payments that you discuss. Are there any questions, like even basic questions about what is this, what is that, before we continue? Alec, this is Professor Alec Holcomb right here from history.
So I'm just curious, you mentioned the Islamic funding where there's, because of Islamic beliefs, interest things is not acceptable. I was wondering if you could give us some more examples of ways in which culture plays a role in interacting with these new forms of
With the new
finance. I'm
technologies.
kind of curious. I'm trying to think of it. I have some experience in Vietnam, and
Right.
Ivan, I'm sure, I remember my first time ever texting was in Vietnam when cell phones were there, and I used to have a phone just like the one that was up there. And I thought, wow, the Vietnamese love texting, and back in the U.S., nobody
Mobile
really
text.
texted. And I thought, I wonder what that is. Maybe it's just cheaper to text. And now I feel like America has completely followed in the footsteps, and
Right.
people love texting as well. And I just wonder, I'd be curious to know some other
Right.
kind of cultural things that he's turned out from his research.
Did you hear that question? I can
Yeah,
repeat it.
I did.
Okay,
That's-
awesome.
And I don't want to sort of steal anybody's thunder for what's coming later, because I know they're going to show you a little film clip as
Right.
well that gets into the work of one of the researchers we supported in Kenya, looking at some of the cultural and social dimensions of the use of mobile money. But maybe I can just throw out something that's a little bit more recent, which is early on, we started to notice that people were using things around like lucky numbers with their mobile money or with their payment behavior, not just with phones, but even with just like cash and coins. Like the oracle in kind of divination-oriented religious groups in Nigeria would demand payment for his services in a particular denomination or in an amount of money that added up to, or had fours in it or had sixes in it or that sort of a thing. And so we started talking to folks in the tech industry about that. Like, maybe you should design stuff that lets people do things like this. And then, of course, come to find out, like, many years later, how did mobile phone-based payment take off in China? It took off in China when the companies who were putting together these smartphone-based mobile payment services, WeChat Pay and Alipay, did huge promotions around the time of Lunar New Year, where people could send to each other over their phones little like digital red envelopes, like the red envelope that you give someone with a little bit of cash inside of it for the new year to wish them good luck. And they made these little digital ones that you could send that just, took off like wildfire. And most importantly, I think, kind of got out the general idea into Chinese society that this is something that paying people is something you can do on your phone, and that it's totally normal and fun, right? And then bam, it just took off. It took off because of its use of that cultural system, as well as some other technological things that were taking place at the time. But that's one example. Smokey and Ivan, are you going to show them the 13th cow for the social networks video?
We were gonna show the social network, the network video.
Okay.
Sibel's net. I don't know exactly which one is. The 13 cows in the book though. So if anyone wants to buy the book,
Well, I'll just say really briefly.
it's the
if you
last.
buy the
He
book-
loves this photo so much. This is the 13 cow. I can pass this around. You guys, we can do that. I'll pass this around.
Yeah, pass it around.
You can
But just very
explain.
briefly, one of the things that Sibel Kusimba and others have now written about is the use of mobile money in Sub-Saharan Africa to do things like save up and then execute a bride wealth payment, or the payment that takes place as the kind of return of bride wealth at the initiation of a young man into society. So it's culture all the way through, the way these things
Right.
are being used.
Right. And I was gonna say, just to piggyback on that is sort of like a lot of the chapters in this book address this question. I mean, that's sort of like their premise of asking how do old and new technologies of money make sense? How are they used contextually? What the meaning of them is in the actual particular cultural historical context. So that's sort of the approach of this book, is to talk about all these topics that are touched on by policymakers, by development, people who are interested in development, or even economists who look into money, but take a sort of sociocultural approach to them. I'm hearing an echo of myself, so I don't know. It's okay? Okay. Okay, at this point, what we were planning to do next, and since you can stay with us, we'll go back to questions, is we want to give a sort of overview of the book, like what is in the book, and sort of who, and start talking about some themes. And then as we do this, actually feel free to jump in if you have any questions. These are sort of informal events, and we like to have it more of a conversational style. Okay, so I'm glad that you mentioned, you've already covered a lot of the stuff that I was thinking, would take some time to cover. So I'm going to pick it up where Ivan and I joined IMTFI, and we started helping a lot of the researchers sort of work through their papers. One of the things that we first did when we joined IMTFI was help edit what turned into working papers that we would publish regularly on IMTFI's website. And then by the sort of midway through our tenure there, we started thinking about putting together some of these papers and actually creating a book that sort of brought together these projects and sites that seemed very different, and so it seemed very challenging to sort of talk about them all together, but obviously it worked. But just to give you a sense, so the book is organized in 4 parts that sort of speak to specific themes, and the parts are inclusion and exclusion, so talking about questions of financial inclusion, value and wealth, which is a major theme in anthropology, technology and social relations, and design and practice. We have 13 chapters that are based on original research, and the sites, I'm going to list all the sites where these research projects take place, just to give you the sense of the wide scope of this project. Dominican Republic, Haiti, Kenya, Nepal, Mexico, Cuba, Chile, South Africa, Ethiopia, Colombia, India, and the Philippines. And we also have, all the authors came from various disciplines, right? As Bill mentioned, anthropology, sociology, economics, international development, business, IT, but also we had practitioners who work in NGO and international development sector, and a team of designers. And they work as professors, as researchers, as consultants, so they have different roles. So that makes it a very rich book. It also, at the beginning, it made it hard to sort of establish a way to how to link these conversations together. In addition to the fellows from the IMTFI, there's also 4 commentaries by leading scholars in different fields. One scholar is Ananya Roy. She's a leading figure in the writes about poverty and the global industry of microfinance and financial inclusion. Jane Geyer, another leading economic anthropologist, and speaks to how this research speaks to theories of money and value. And then we had Jenna Burrell, who has a background in technology, and so she speaks to technology and social relations, and Joshua Blumenstock, also from IT communications, and he commented on the sort of design potential of some of these projects. So just to give you a very sort of broad idea of some of the research topics that were covered in the book, they span a wide range of topics that relate to monetary practices and technologies, from traditional forms of money and wealth, such as cash and cattle, piggy banks, gold jewelry, and land, and roskas, to more recent technologies, such as mobile money that we have heard about, digital cash grants, and biometric identification. Now, the chapters talk about very different sites and very different practices. There's several themes that run through the book, but I want to highlight one of them first, which is pretty much all of the authors share a sense of ethnographic sensibility to the study of money and finance. even those who are actually not ethnographers. In fact, one of my favorite chapters in the book is the last chapter that is written by designers. They're designers. They looked at everyday practices by informal workers in the city of Medellin in Colombia, and they have they're naturally born ethnographers. They have a very ethnographic sense of looking at sort of cultural practices of how, what counts as wealth for people in that particular situation, value, and they are also thinking in terms of design terms of how to design financial services that actually serve the needs and the ideas of value and wealth for people on the ground. So that is just one example. And then Ivan's going to highlight another theme.
So, I just wanted to, this is such a special event to be able to come here and celebrate the launch of this. Actually, the paperback version just came out this week. So it's a much more affordable and accessible version of the book. And, we've been working on this for years together with Bill and Smokey and the contributors to this volume. And what I loved about working on this book is that it allowed me to bring together my interests in anthropology, in international development, in international relations. I originally did my graduate work in international affairs and worked in the international development field for a while, and then came into anthropology, and I just wrote a book on remittances and migration between the US and Vietnam. If you're around tomorrow, I'm giving a talk about that at 5 p.m. But this allowed me to think about issues of remittances in comparative perspective, and also to have a conversation across different disciplines and different practices. The kinds of things that are being explored in this book are emerging issues that are approached from a range of angles, and there's a lot of different things at stake. Issues of poverty reduction potential, technology uptake, social behaviors around financial practices. Kind of exploring this and crossing those not only disciplinary boundaries but practitioner boundaries, I think was a really fruitful part of this project. Smokey and I spent quite a bit of time working together to write an introduction to kind of bring together the themes of this book, and Bill wrote a conclusion to the book. Thinking about where our interventions are being made, but what really I think comes through with the book is in the book is the rich ethnography that each of these authors contributes. We wanted to include a range of authors who are deeply immersed or from the places that they're writing about. None of these authors have a parachute-in perspective, no matter what disciplinary or professional background that they're coming from. And so one of the things that I think is really helpful that comes out of this book is how ethnography can drive theory rather than the other way around. In this process, I think it's important that we rely on our background as anthropologists or observers that place value in participatory immersion approaches in ways that allow the stories to kind of lead the way to our interpretive frameworks. And so a lot of times it's, we're asked to come up with predictive patterns or applied models, especially when it comes to technology, whether in the form of electronic cash grants or mobile money or biometric identification technologies. And oftentimes when we put that faith in a particular form of technology that's being introduced, these can too quickly become all-encompassing solutions. And it is important to have these kinds of solutions. People are interested in addressing very real problems, especially in the case of this book of how to help migrants, in particular rural to urban migrants who are trying to safely and cost-effectively and time-effectively send money back to their home communities. Mobile money, which is kind of a central feature in many of the chapters in this book, mobile money has offered a wonderful solution for many migrant dilemmas, and it's therefore no surprise that it's been taken up eagerly in particularly places like the Philippines and Kenya. But I think what you see when you look through the chapters in this book is that mobile money is working in concert with other financial practices and activities at the same time. And when you listen to the stories, when you read the stories that these authors are telling, we see that in order to effectively introduce technologies and regulatory systems to benefit migrants, we have to see all the other ways that people are managing and navigating value and savings. And so when we focus, I think, too much on the story of the technology itself, rather than the stories of the people that are using that technology, it becomes easy to come up with ideas like kill cash. This is a sentiment that we often hear in the development community that's interested in some of these financial technologies, that cash is the enemy. Cash needs to be replaced by digital technologies that offer a more seemingly more direct path of value transfer. But there's lots of like financial technology professionals that are interested in kind of pulling all kinds of different financial and payment practices into a contained financial ecosystem. But when we look at the stories in these chapters, we see that money is diversifying in different forms through financial technology interventions, but it doesn't necessarily replace or exclude other forms. And so when we hear about some of the particular stories in this volume, Sepada Bajracharya writes about rotating credit and savings associations in Nepal, and how these are these kinds of vibrant social events that bring people together, that are not just about savings and credit, but kind of bringing communities together. And there's a kind of an affective level of pleasure and risk that takes place in these gatherings. Mrinalini Tanka writes about how Cubans conceptualize their country's place in the global economy, as well as how they relate to revolutionary memories through kind of a dual currency system where there is an exchangeable peso and one that's used within the country. Another contributor talks about how mobile money illuminates gender support networks in Kenya, but at the same time cannot necessarily replace the sociality of personal prestations when migrants return to their villages. So, and how oftentimes that transfer of value is a collective process, giving money back to a community of people rather than to an individual. And mobile money kind of complicates a lot of that. If you're sending money back to your home, but not personally taking that money back there, then that gets rid of some of the social processes of that return and the social processes of prestation. So, I think for me it's been interesting to work on this project as an anthropologist. I've always had an interest in how anthropology can dialogue with public policy issues. And sometimes it seems as anthropologists that we're always trying to complicate things. We're complexifying things, and people often want us to come up with clear-cut solutions. And I don't think that's a bad thing, either to complexify things or to come up with solutions. There's different people have different roles in the process, but by working with others whose job it is to come up with those solutions, and by looking at some of the complexities involved in that, I think we can perhaps have a better informed production of models that ultimately can contribute to addressing some of these very real issues, especially when it comes to poverty reduction and helping migrants to remit money back to their families.
I just want to pick up on something, and actually maybe Bill can jump in here too. So one of the things, so you mentioned the sort of how, as people are adopting new technologies, it's not necessarily that they are giving up other technologies, right? So in the sort of, so there is a lot of, as Bill mentioned, there's like a lot of money being thrown into both research and investing into mobile money, digital payments, and there is a whole moral discourse attached to this that's not just about effectiveness, but it's also about how cash is bad, is dirty, is criminal. It's used by terrorists, by corruption. And there's a whole, push that's coming from the top down towards cashlessness, right? And now what people who are working on the ground, right, in Kenya or in India or in Mexico, where a lot of these mobile money products are being used, one of the things that we've observed through their research is that even in places where people are using mobile money, for instance, very successfully, they're using mobile money for certain kinds of practices, and they're using cash for other practices, and they're using other forms of payment like jewelry or cattle for other kinds of exchanges and practices, for other forms of wealth. And so this finding actually resonates with something that anthropologists of money and value love to talk about, which is this idea of multiple forms of value and multiple forms of wealth and multiple monetary repertoires. And one of the findings, I think, and lessons, I would say, that IMTFI has been trying to push in this sort of global scene of financial inclusion is that ending cash is not necessarily the goal, right? Because locally, people are using cash for specific purposes. So sort of being attentive to local practices more than having a sort of hierarchy of payments, of saying this one is better than the other. Bill, I don't know if you wanted to jump in. So Bill has worked a lot on talking about platforms and the sort of how these different technologies sort of are symbiotic with one another more than. I don't know if you could hear me. Oh, oops. Again.
A total.
Okay. Okay, so basically, can you hear me now?
Just a sec.
I could also type. I could type this out. Okay.
Oh wait, hey, can you hear me? I can hear you,
Yeah,
but it
okay.
wasn't me.
Yes. Okay, I can just sum up. Basically, I was just talking about one of the findings that we found that was sort of an interesting finding from the research as a collective is this idea that people use multiple forms of money, not one versus the other. So that when people are starting to use mobile money, doesn't mean that they're not going to use cash. And so I'm just basically talking about how that research finding, which you can't find through a McKinsey research survey, but you will find through a 9-month research of ethnographic, qualitative methods, sort of speaks back to this the bigger global mantra against cash, right?
Yeah.
So I know that you've done a lot of work around sort of platforms and multiple means of payment, right? So I didn't know if you wanted to say something.
Sure. I mean, just there's the really basic anthropological insight that comes out of the work of Jane Geyer, who's in this book, but then which we, with IMTFI, were really able to kind of bring up and bring out in a new way, that people are always earmarking and sequestering money, right? There are bits of money that they'll take out of circulation and earmark for a special purpose. So the money that's in the kid's piggy bank is different from the money that I have in my wallet. And if I break into the kid's piggy bank to use that money to go buy alcohol, that's like really, really, really bad, right? Or people will take gifted money and treat it differently from their general fund and that sort of a thing. And so Jane Geyer had written about the sort of monetary repertoires that people engage in as they are earmarking or sequestering special monies. And what we really kind of brought out based on her work was that we need to look at not just the monetary repertoire, the different things that people do with money and the different ways that they do it, the style with which they do it, but also people's monetary ecologies. What were the different platforms, devices, material things, living things that all work together as a kind of, in a kind of system, like an ecology, that people are using to settle transactions with one another, reckon value in the immediate or in the long-term time horizon, and so on. So we really did try to foster this kind of dual focus on both monetary ecologies and monetary repertoires. And you don't have to get too far afield to think about these things. Like, for the people in the room who use Venmo, think about what you use Venmo for, right? And how you use Venmo differently from PayPal, and how you use both of those things differently from your debit card or from cash, right? What are the transactions that you use Venmo for, and why? How come you don't do everything with Venmo, and that sort of a thing? So we actually have just been doing some research here at IMTFI, looking at young people's use of various budgeting apps like Mint, which some of you may use. And one of the things that came up in that research that was just kind of fascinating and hilarious was that Mint really can't deal with Venmo transactions. It lumps them all together. And if you try to enter in more detail about a Venmo transaction that took place, and like in the example that came out of one of our interviews, the first time during the study when she used Venmo to pay for something, she used it to pay for babysitting, okay? So she entered into Mint, into this app, babysitting, so that it would know that it was babysitting, not some generic Venmo thing. But then she used Venmo throughout the month and never had time to like enter a category for each one. So the app kept telling her that she was spending way too much money on babysitting, and maybe she had to adjust her spending in that category, right? It sort of didn't have any sense of what was going on, that this was all Venmo for the rent, Venmo for dinner out with friends, Venmo to whatever, split a bill, that sort of thing, and Venmo for babysitting. So when we think about our own practices in our own lives, how do we use different forms of money and payment for different purposes? How do we use them according to different time horizons? How do we use them in terms of different cycles, right? The academic year cycle, my retirement account cycle, the cycle just of the day or of the week or of the month. So yeah, this is a point that we kept coming to again and again and again, because we kept seeing it in the data across all of the different sites, these diverse repertoires and ecologies. And so, we also see quite clearly that when a new technology for payment comes to town, it doesn't replace an old one. It just gets added into the mix. So it's added into the portfolio, and maybe you'll see the use of one of them diminish a little bit, but it's still there, right, to be called on if needed. And an example there you can think of would be for some people it would be cash. For many people, I think in the U.S. right now, it would be checks. But the check is still there if you need it, right? And there are special instances in which the check is the way to go. For sentimental reasons, sending a check in a card, or receiving a check in a card. To other reasons of necessity, sending a banker's check because you don't have a bank account.
That's great. We can take more questions. There was two things that we wanted to do that I'm wondering about. Is Jenny like are you in Jenny's office right now?
Yeah, and okay. Jenny is at the ready.
Okay, and we can wait, but basically one of the things that we wanted to talk about, in addition to talking about the sort of content of the book, was also about the process of being able to bring the book together. And one of the things that we've talked a little bit about how we got there, how the fellows got there, but there's a lot of work that goes behind the scenes that has to do with things like getting the IRBs from these different countries, getting the photos, staying in contact, because this project took so long. If you think about when these fellows first applied, when they got the funding, when they wrote the article, and by the time we're bothering them with editing and copy editing questions and copyright questions, and the person behind the scene who has enabled us to keep all those strings together is the administrator of IMTFI, Jenny Fan, who is in that office. And she just want to say hi very quickly before we play Sibel's. Can you hear me? Oh my We can't hear you. I know. There's something about this. It's very sensitive wire. It's gonna work. Don't worry. Ah.
There we
there
go.
she is.
Perfect. We'll start moving again.
So, hi, Jenny. Jenny can talk to you about. So, Jenny is also the sort of like glue of the community that Bill is talking about. She knows everyone. So, whenever we had to contact someone and say, hey, we still need your, I don't know, something, your signature on this, Jenny would be like, oh, they're vacationing here or they have a research project there.
I'm just gonna sit here.
Yes. Hi, everybody.
Hi, could you hear me, Jenny?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us. Yeah.
Do you want to
Well,
say anything about like how much time you spent on this project?
Yeah, no, I mean, first of all, like, this book has been a huge endeavor. So kudos to Smokey, Bill, and Ivan and all the researchers involved, because it's really true. Like, I mean, what they don't mention is there's 31 authors, that they had to work with overall. And actually, I took a look, in my emails, and the start of this project was back in 2013, like when they finally got all the papers and everything together. So that's 2013, 2008, that's 6 years. And that's like after the year-long research project was done, that's after the IRB was done, that's after the reports and papers were done. So, it's, there's a lot of, there's just a lot of background stuff going on. And I would say the two big things, I guess, in a project like this is just to keep in mind, like, the timeline. I mean, like, because we're dealing in this particular project, like, we were dealing with people on 8 different countries, and as Smokey mentioned, it was like India, Philippines, Kenya, Mexico, France, Argentina, Ethiopia, and Colombia. So it's like a lot of juggling. Just gotta, but it's actually fantastic too if you're able to do it. It's a very exciting thing to do. But like,
all the authors love Jenny, and sometimes they would write to Jenny like editorial questions because they think that Jenny was so central to that communication that it really was like she was the go-to person whenever they had a question. Thanks. I'm gonna now show the Sibel's video. So I'm moving on. Thanks so much.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
Oh, wait.
is Bill
Are you leaving, Bill?
or are you staying for the video? Bye, Bill. They're actually on stream. They're seeing us on streaming, so this is great. So what we want to show is, so we mentioned this project a couple of times, and luckily one of the researchers she's actually an archaeologist by training, but she's been doing a lot of cultural anthropology work around mobile money in Kenya. But she's been doing I'll change that. Here we go. Okay, so hold on, because this all logged me out completely. So Sibel Kusimba and her team, she's been working on this now for a really long time. So this is a short 7-minute video. What I really like about her work is that she actually does this thing that is very traditional anthropology. For those of you who are my students, although some of you left, and 1010, and economic anthropology, and anthropology of bubbles. So she uses kinship charts. Anthropologists love kinship charts, or the old school anthropologists love kinship charts, but she uses them in a very innovative way to show how mobile money is being sent among kin members, right? And then she shows, in some ways, I think, her research also shows how social ties and kinship ties are also reshaped around these money sending practices. So in a way, she's also sort of rewriting the kinship chart through mobile money. So that's pretty innovative.
This anthropological project had as its first objective trying to understand how people use mobile phones here in Western Kenya. M-Pesa is a mobile money sending service that was introduced in Kenya in 2007. Since then, it has become extremely popular. Many development economists approach the study of mobile money from a financial inclusion perspective. This project takes an anthropological approach. It sees the practices of mobile money as a part of an existing social and cultural background. This area is a rapidly changing but still predominantly rural area. People are involved in agriculture, but also many other ways of making a living. Trading, having small shops. One important source of income is mobile money remittances. Remittances have a variety of purposes in Western Kenya.
Ebugale narwara eja nanyolekhana ndi accident mala omundu wandumala chisende narumisila kaba japu ni wandumala mala chanjenda. Kama utaka kununua ng'ombe ama kujenga nyumba ani shughuli kubwa kubwa ama mtu amekosa school fees unaweza kuenda ukatransfer ukamsaidia.
Remittances have economic uses, but they also have important social meanings. They express caring and create relationships based on the exchange of assistance.
When I'm just feeling good and I have a little money, then sometimes I'll send something to my grandmothers.
For urban or international migrants, they are a way of maintaining social relationships and social presence in a community. There's an interesting duality to the mobile phone. On the one hand, mobile phones create connections and relationships.
I think M-Pesa has made relationships stronger, and they help you save on time and energy and money.
On the other hand, mobile phones also highlight the ability of individuals to create and shape their networks. They give individuals a lot of autonomy or agency in shaping their connections with others. People use mobile money to participate in groups.
Through mobile, it's easy for people to send their monthly subscriptions or contributions.
A quarter of the money that is contributed in steering committees when we have funerals is by this.
This concept of money pooling has become very, very common, and I found it to be widely used amongst siblings, family groups, but also students. In order to understand how money circulates in groups, I've been using social network analysis to actually draw the pathways of mobile money remittances in families and groups. As an example, Sarah is a Maragoli woman living in Kimilili. Her mother was the third wife of a polygynous man. At his death, the other wives chased her mother away from the homestead. They moved to Kimilili, where Sarah's older sister Joyce married a Dutch man. Joyce now lives in Holland and sends Sarah $200 to $300 each month. She uses the funds to support her friend and fellow seamstress Cecilia. She also sends remittances to her brother, her mother's brother, and her mother's sister's children. Her 20-year-old niece Flora attends an accounting college. Flora receives the most remittances in this network. She receives money from her mother, her aunts, and her uncles. Using mobile communication, individuals like Sarah can shape networks based on dormant kinship ties and on the existing importance of siblings in Kenyan families. The project drew mobile money graphs for 14 families. This allowed us to examine the main properties of the networks. They are based around groups of siblings. They are often connected to other groups of siblings by relationships of descent or marriage. Men and women participate equally in these networks, and people of all ages and genders can become central in networks. Furthermore, these networks are dense. Individuals have many connections to other individuals. These are properties that maximize the distribution of mobile money across a family group. They represent the way long-term traditions of mutual support and reciprocity are now expressed through the medium of mobile phone use. One thing we found was that women tend to receive a lot of remittances. Just because women receive a lot of remittances doesn't necessarily mean that they benefit from them in ways that we expect.
I know my grandmother, she has many friends and they'll come to her for help. They'll be like, my sons are not working and I have this problem, can you help me out? So they'll be like reaching out to her for help.
So the ethic of generosity also places pressure on people to recirculate remittances to a certain degree. The individuality of mobile money and mobile phones often means that the secrecy, the privacy, and the exclusion that is allowed by mobile phone communication is very important.
People use their phones as a way to shut out people that they don't want to talk to.
People try to manage their participation in these groups that circulate money by turning off their phone. In an extreme case, you could even get a new SIM card, which is often taken to mean that you want to sever contact indefinitely. We met many people who complained about the ability of mobile phone connections to disrupt other important social relationships.
A husband may beat his wife because of the phone.
Mobile phones have caused marriage breakages in our country.
Mobile money has empowered individuals to create a networked self. In so doing, it has allowed individuals to create new connections, but also to sever connections. Social life in Kenya is being dramatically changed by the use of the mobile phone as individuals create more control over the social connections that they produce and participate in.
So she has one chapter in the book that talks precisely about this. And she has more charts. So, you know, that chart that she had in the beginning, that's the kinship chart that we're talking about. The circles for female, triangles for male. Yes? I always mix them up. I was not trained in traditional anthropology. I think at this point we want to really open it up for questions and see if you guys have any questions about this project or other projects or the book more generally. Yes, Darby.
Since the book has been published, what has the Institute been doing?
So first of all, we left the Institute in 2014, which has been, it's a long time now, right? So the Institute has continued to fund on the same sort of model up until very recently, and now it's sort of shifting some of its attention to some of the projects that Bill mentioned that are more local. But what I thought you were going to ask me was, since the book is being published, like, has there been anything around it? And what I thought about was like how I'm using the book in my classroom, and I forgot to mention this before. But anyway, I can talk about that. But yeah, the Institute continues to work on money. The focus has changed a little bit. It doesn't do the sort of the large scale in terms of the number of researchers that it funds, and that's why it was so important to actually have sort of a product of that research that happened over a long period of time. One thing that that it was really hard to do, and you sort of feel sad about, is there are so many researchers. There are like 120. You had a number. What's the number of researchers? And we had to sort of pick, and this was already like too many chapters for a book of this sort for academia. And one of the things that I think sometimes when we talk about IMT5 more generally, this is really just representation of a small slice of the other projects that people are doing.
Yeah, and I think also, I mean, the Institute is transitioning. They have different grant funders, and so they're thinking about different issues. Bill mentioned some of the work that they're doing on financial practices here in the United States. And so I think what's been interesting for us is to kind of, we had very specific dissertations that, thought about economic anthropology, but we got to think about these in comparative perspective. And this has also led to invitations to further conversations since then. I mean, a lot of this is about financial practices in the global south, but recently I've been invited to be part of a working group through the Nordic Research Council on cashlessness, and so cashlessness is a big issue in Europe, in Sweden in particular, where they don't use the euro. Nobody wants to use the Swedish kroner, so everybody's been pushing cashlessness as this kind of much more efficient form of payment. But there's a lot of interest in how that's also excluding certain populations, especially older folks. They can't even go to a coffee shop and just buy a cup of coffee because everything is cashless now on cards. And so there's been a lot of grants thinking about cashlessness, but then this then starts a conversation about cashlessness in the global south and the global north, and how can we kind of think about these things together. So I think IMTFI is going in new directions, and I think each of us is also going in different directions with our conversations since this book.
Actually, cashlessness has been it's a topic in the industry, in development. The IMTFI, I think, was it last year, that produced a sort of a white paper. So they do that kind of work too, where they'll produce white papers on specific topics. So that was one, and actually that was very valuable because it actually made the case based on all the studies, and that was written by another postdoc that came there after us, Ursula. If she were there, hello. And so that also made this case for why actually cash is useful and important, and this anti-cash campaigns are not necessarily going to give those results that are promoted or advertised. Yes, Larry.
Yeah, I wonder if any of your research has touched on the political meaning of alternative monies. I guess I think it would be more prominent maybe in the global north than the global south.
Well, so Bill mentioned that he's worked on alternative monies, on the Ithaca Hour, and I think I've read the stuff that he wrote on that, but it's been a long time ago. But yeah, I mean, I think the political meaning is always sort of part of this research. In some projects more or less than others, but definitely in our own work, politics matter so I'm not going to speak specifically to alternative money, but for instance, actually, since you mentioned alternative money, and I know you're thinking about, for instance, Ithaca Hour, but Bitcoin was also considered as a sort of alternative money, and one of the things that a lot of people had a cult following around Bitcoin when it first was introduced, because it was supposed to be more democratic, because it was supposed to be non-state money, right? So and because it was considered as an alternative currency. And once again, Bill actually has written a lot about Bitcoin. I feel bad I'm talking for Bill, and Bill was here. Sorry, Bill, if you're watching this. But so I think that aspect is, we're always touching on that. The other part with mobile money, one of the things, and we haven't mentioned this, but we do we raise this issue in the introduction. One of the issues behind whether mobile money is effective or not, or if it's taken up or not, is actually a political decision about whether mobile money the mobile services that are being regulated, allowed to operate in a country, whether they'll be tied to a banking system or not. And that makes a huge difference in the fees. The whole reason why mobile money in Kenya has been such a success is that the telecoms there found a way to circumvent the banking system. And so when you open up an M-Pesa account, it is not connected to a bank account. And since banks are less accessible, more expensive, this is how M-Pesa has become sort of taken over the realm where that banks used to occupy, because they have a wider spread of agent networks, they have lower fees, and it's just easier to transact, and people don't have to have a bank account to be able to use an M-Pesa account. But that decision is a political decision, and it's a huge decision. And in other countries, that's not the case, because the banking industry is a huge lobby, and it will have many arguments for why that should not happen. Security reasons, market, I mean, like, who wants the market, right? So that question, that is an important political question that comes up a lot especially when there is a discussion about the regulation around these services. And that pairs up with a cultural aspect. So it's not only culture, but regulation, law, since we're in law, justice, and culture audience here, but regulatory questions and decisions are really important in terms of what types of money is going to be introduced and how is it going to look, how is mobile money going to look in Kenya. I actually, right after I left IMTFI and I came here, I left in middle of September to do this really fast trip to Albania with another colleague, and we wrote a paper about the financial inclusion scene in Albania, and I realized when I went there that the reason why they were pushing for this paper is that Vodafone was trying to introduce mobile payment in Albania, and they were really using the M-Pesa model, pushing it, and but the Albanian central bank would not allow them to have this separate life outside of the banking system. And so they eventually did actually launch that service, but it was attached to the banking account.
Yeah, and on that note, I mean, a lot of the excitement about mobile money in particular was because of its role in financial inclusion for unbanked populations. But there is, that regulatory aspect is important. There's a reason why it's so popular in Kenya and the Philippines, and it's not that easy to change those laws. There's a lot of pressure to make sure that governments are adhering to anti-money laundering regulations, including know your customer requirements, where you have to really have a lot of documentation and paperwork if you're going to be transferring money. And so, there's been all this excitement about mobile money, in the years after this, but a lot of times now when people are talking about mobile money, and, I do work in Vietnam, and I ask people about, kind of startups and entrepreneurs about this, there's not an understanding that mobile money is kind of specific to, a regulatory framework that allows telecom operators to basically act as banks, to be able to cash in but also cash out money. Mm. And again, this is kind of the formalization of the process. What's so interesting about this, and again, Bill showed us that phone. If you pick up this book and you think about technology, you might think, well, this doesn't look very technologically advanced, this kind of old school Nokia phone on the front cover. But this is exactly the kind of phone that people are using in the global south. And these practices of transferring value started with migrants trying to figure out, okay, I don't have a bank account, I don't have time to travel back to my hometown, which takes 2 days, and I don't have and it's dangerous, I might get robbed along the way, so how do I transfer that value? Well, they started to transfer airtime, and that began a process of formalizing that of formalization, which now lots of these startup companies are interested in. Right. But without kind of understanding that long process of kind of organically navigating these technologies, you can't just kind of introduce that solution elsewhere and expect it to work in the same way as it did in the success models such as Kenya and the Philippines.
Larry kind of had my question, which was about the political thing. I guess I want to just push it a little more. I'm curious, China is such a huge country, it's so influential, and can you give us a sense for how the Chinese government has responded to this? Has this sort of thing taken off there? Are people in China allowed to have?
Well, interestingly, when we were working at IMTFI, there was no project in China.
We were trying to get projects.
Yeah.
applicants from China all the time.
But I know that they had this huge conference and collaboration, and as Bill mentioned, apparently now it has boomed through this, the gift giving through the mobile phone. But I actually don't know because none of our researchers actually worked on this at the time. But it is a great question. But see, with China, right, you have, again, the state, so in places where you have very strong regulatory regime over financial transaction, I think mobile money, will respond differently. But again, yeah, it's interesting because 5 years ago, like there was nothing on China. There was nobody doing stuff on China. But I think now there's more. A, there is mobile money being used, and B, there's more people researching it.
Yeah,
but I don't know the
we
specifics.
We did have one grantee that was a kind of design team that looked at how to introduce
it, right? So it wasn't there yet.
And looking at the problem, there's lots of rural to urban migrants in China. How are they transferring value? But again, I mean, the telecommunications networks are very much monitored by the Chinese government, and
so.
To the extent that mobile money is there, it's really kind of a banked mobile money. And when people talk about it, usually it's more about the way we might think of it, an app on your phone that connects to your bank that allows you to transfer that money, rather than this kind of unbanked process or on-ramp to banking that exists elsewhere.
But one side where there was a lot of potential, right, when we were on this, was India. Because it was thought that India was very comparable to Kenya. It's a big country, large population, very large rural population. The dynamic that Sibel described in Kenya, like that is very similar in India, where you have rural migrants to cities that are trying to send money back home. And also in India, you have a lack of such a broad bank branch network, right? So banks are not going to be in places where there's not enough customers, when there's not interest in, having customers. So there's a lot of unbanked. And so we had at some point we had 9 projects in India, people research, and there were actually a few mobile money services that were being offered. But in India, what we found from the research, and one of the articles is included here, the reach is not being to the same extent as in Kenya. It has not had that same sort of boom and take up. And part of it is because in India, the mobile money services were obliged to have a connection to a bank account, which actually raised the fees. Eventually, the fees started going up. They were very low in the beginning, and we have to understand that the difference between a mobile money transaction and bank transaction is that mobile money transactions are usually very low in amount. So if you are sending very small money and then you have to pay high fees, it just doesn't make sense for you to use mobile money to do that, right? So, but that is another example for how politics plays an important role in how these technologies are going to play out differently in different places.
Do you remember how the Indian government justified that insistence that it go through?
Actually, it's the KYC, the Know Your Customer regulations. So security, identity. It's easier with. Yeah, I mean I don't. Okay, this is not. Don't take my word for it. I didn't read the documents, but I think that was one. At least the argument was that you want to have, because this is a financial transaction, that there needs to be some secure way of knowing that who is the person who is sending the money, and that technology is not provided by the telecoms, but it is provided by banks, or at least that's how banks make their claim for why telecoms need to be attached to them. Now, of course, the bank that they were, at least one of the mobile money services that we knew about was the State Bank of India, which is a state bank. So there is also that, in that context, there is that interest, I think, too. But typically, that's the argument that is used to force telecoms to have this connection with bank accounts. That so it's a security reason, right? That if we don't have proper know your customer provisions, then you can have, you know, potential for you transferring money for terrorism or this or that, right? I mean, again, this is the official line, but that is usually used, at least when I was in Albania and I was interviewing bankers and telecoms, the bankers would always say, or even regulators, they would say that this is the issue, right? That this is why we will allow mobile money, but there has to be this connection with a bank account.
And
For
there's
security
also,
reasons.
I mean, I think what's interesting too is there's a lot of conversations that are happening in the background that we also got to see, you know, to get a taste of in the process of doing the research at the Institute. You know, part of it is having conversations so that regulators are coming and kind of understanding what this new technology is, that it's not necessarily going to facilitate, you know, money laundering or terrorist financing. And
Right.
so, you know, one of the highlights for me of my postdoc at Irvine was going to Kenya, and there was a GSMA Association Mobile Money for the Unbanked conference. GSM, you know, there's the what do you call it? What does it stand for? It's, you know, your SIM card is, or your it's the network basically that your mobile phone is connected to. So the GSM Association is interested in being able to expand mobile money services, but part of it is getting regulators from different governments to kind of change the laws to allow that to be introduced in different countries. Yeah. So in this case, the Mobile Money for the Unbanked conference that was in Nairobi had a lot of these telecom companies there, and people and from the technology industry that were interested in kind of, you know, introducing these new applications. But also the UN had funded a number of regulators from central banks to come to this conference as well to participate in this conversation and to kind of understand this new technology and where it was going. And so, you know, the hope that they can eventually convince, you know, Indian regulators to perhaps transition and be more accepting of this technology in the future.
Yeah. Yeah, the thing with regulation was big. In Albania too, actually I realized, I was like, why are they trying to, it seemed so unprofitable, the mobile money service in Albania. Albania is a small country. People don't need to send money, you know, they just travel, right, themselves. And there is more widespread banking system. And I finally figured out, again, in the backdoor conversations, that it really wasn't about Albania. It was because Albania was very close to European Union and is trying to become part of the European Union, and all its infrastructure, all its government, finance, everything is trying to align with the European Union. Basically, Vodafone was trying to use Albania and Romania as sort of backdoor into EU. So by pushing this really forcefully in these places, they wanted to then move sort of to Europe and trying to push against the regulations there. European Union has really strong regulations against this separation between banking, you know, creation of a separate banking sphere through the telecom. So it was very political in this way, that there was this huge push against regulations that in the eye of telecom industry favor the banking sector.
One last question, sorry.
Yes.
Do the telecoms accept that claim that they're insecure, or that there's not, or do they push back and say, we can make our
right? They do push
this
back.
is ridiculous.
Yes,
Why
they
are
say they push back and they try to show that actually they are very secure, that they have a system of tracing customers, but it's not it's not convincing to it's not convincing to the regulators.
And part of it is to say that these are small transfers, right? These are,
Yeah.
you know, small remittance transfers of $10, $20. So, you know, it's not like there's massive capital flows that are going on here.
Actually, it's funny. Some of the ads for these services feature like this migrant remittance, or families sending money to their children who are studying right in another city. So those are the sort of scenarios that the telecoms are trying to say, hey, we can help you with this, we can make this easier, and trying to kind of create that image that this is actually helping financial inclusion rather than, creating a security problem.
I think we're just past time,
Oh, we
actually,
are past time?
6:33.
Well, thank you all for sticking it out. Thank you, Haley, so much for hosting the event and CLJC. I was telling some of the students earlier that I wasn't even thinking about a book launch, and Haley's like, no, we should have a book launch. And this is like a great ritual that the CLJC has started with creating this opportunity, because you write your book, and we wrote the introduction so long ago, and by the time it comes to your door, you're like, okay, what do I have to do next? And so it's kind of nice to have a moment to reconnect, because we don't see each other anymore, and to kind of think about what went into this process and what are some of the takeaways. And I've mentioned this before, but some of my students have already been reading this book, and it's a very useful pedagogical tool for my economic anthropology courses, because it's actually written in a very accessible, the chapters are written in a very accessible way. And I had the student this semester who took my course last semester and was referring to the Roskas, this chapter that Ivan mentioned earlier about the Roskas in Nepal. And I was like, oh my God, like that article, that chapter actually like stayed with you. And they're like, yeah, I really understood it. And it was, so anyway, I'm gonna leave you with that.
And we have books for sale
We
here.
have books for sale, and Anna has been sitting there. We can sign it for you. And also tomorrow, Ivan Small is gonna give a talk on his own authored book on remittances between Vietnam and the United States. It's on Bentley, Annex 102, from 4 to 5, actually.
4 to 5? No,
yes.
5 to 6, okay.
No, yes. 5 to 6 is drinks at Jackie O's. You're all welcome to join. We'll pay with Venmo.
Thank you, everybody,
Thank
for coming.
you.